Hey guys, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about bleeding control. Now, before we start anything with bleeding control, we have to take care of ourselves. So it's important that we maintain our PPE, our exam gloves, eye protection, and even if you have just minimal stuff, that Ziploc bag may be a good fit to protect yourself. There are different types of bleeding, internal and external. Now, internal isn't as easy to see. So we'll talk about that in another lesson. We're going to focus on external bleeding. That's usually pretty obvious. And there are three types within that category. There's bleeding from the capillaries, bleeding from veins, and bleeding from arteries. Now, bleeding from the capillaries usually occurs when you fall and scrape your arm or scrape your knee. That slow, dark red, oozing blood, that's a capillary bleed. Those bleeds will typically stop on their own or with a little bit of direct pressure. The next type of bleed is a venous bleed. This is where we have bleeding from a vein. It again is dark red and it pours out. It doesn't just ooze. And this can be serious bleeding depending on where it's located on the body and how much is coming out. Now, the third type of bleed is an arterial bleed. This is the most dangerous of the three types. This is on the high pressure side of the circulatory system. And every time the heart pumps, it moves blood forward in the body under high pressure. Now, when that happens and there's a cut and the person's bleeding from that cut, the blood's going to spurt like a sprinkler. This is a really big problem. So this blood is usually bright red. It spurts. That's what tells us it's an arterial bleed. Now, we definitely can start treating this one with direct pressure, but we may have to escalate to another level. So let's talk about how we control bleeding. Now, for minor bleeding, like an abrasion or the capillary bleed, and even some of the minor venous bleeds, direct pressure would be enough to control that. Now, some of our basic supplies, gauze, 4x4 dimensions, 3x3s are good. Ultimately, whatever you have access to, if it's a clean dressing, that's what we want to use. Now, when it comes to securing the dressing, we can use either roller gauze or an elastic bandage. Either one will do. Again, if you had to improvise, you could use a t-shirt that was cut up, a sock, something just to hold that dressing in place. So Justin has a wound here on his forearm. I'm going to take this clean gauze and I'm going to apply direct pressure. In many cases, that will solve the problem. If the bleeding soaks through this first layer of gauze, I can take another set and apply it to the top and continue that direct pressure. Now, in most cases, we will have solved the bleeding problem. Let's assume that's where we're at. Now I'll take my roller gauze and I will apply a pressure dressing to hold this in place. You know, we're talking about doing this on a trail, and we may need to be able to get the person off the trail. So as I roll, I'm maintaining pressure on the gauze 4x4s, and I'm working my way all the way around, keeping even distribution of the pressure. Now, once I get to the end of the roller gauze, I'm going to have to secure it. Now, there's three ways for me to do this. I can tuck it, I can tie it, or I can tape it. So if I tie it, I'll leave one end dangling out, and as I get around to the end, I'll take my loose end and tie it off. If I tuck it, as I get to the end, I take my loose end, I find a previous wrap, and I tuck it underneath. If I would prefer to tape it, I get to the end, I get a piece of tape that I have in my first aid bag, I tear it off, and I tape it a couple of times to maintain it. And that's how we apply direct pressure to control bleeding. So some key points to remember after we've wrapped the injury. If the hand becomes numb or it starts to turn blue, we've got the pressure dressing too tight. We want to loosen it slightly, but maintain the pressure. One other thing, when we apply that initial pieces of gauze on the wound, that part needs to stay there. As I add additional layers of gauze on top of that, as they become blood soaked, I can remove those and put fresh gauze on. But always leave the base layer there. We don't want to peel it away and cause the bleeding to start again. Now let's talk about tourniquets. Now, in the event that we're unable to control bleeding with direct pressure, or it's a serious bleed with a lot of blood present, we can use a tourniquet. Now, this is a CAT, or a combat application tourniquet. And the one we're using today is the training version. It also comes in an orange and black color. Now let's apply the tourniquet. First thing I want to do is I want to open it up. So now I'm going to apply the tourniquet. As I want to bring it up, I want to be 2 inches above the injury site. So let's say it's here on the bicep. I also never want to apply the tourniquet over a joint, like the elbow, the wrist, the knee, the ankle, always over a fatty part of the body. So I find the red tip and I'm going to snug this down. As I snug this up, it needs really to be tight. Placing a tourniquet is going to hurt. So I get that Velcro initially placed, and then I'm going to turn the windlass rod, that's what this is called. I'm going to turn this until the bleeding stops. So let me show you on the mannequin. So now I've got the tourniquet in place, and I really want to make sure it's snug down. So I loosen the Velcro and pull it snug. It needs to be tight. Again, we have to do this tight so the bleeding will stop. So once I get the Velcro in place, I'm going to turn the windlass rod. I'm going to turn it. It's got to be tight. It's going to hurt. Once I get it to a point where bleeding has stopped, I secure the windlass rod in the holder. I'll take the Velcro and bring it across to help secure the windlass rod, and then bring the time strap over the top. At this point, I'll document what time this was applied. Now, once this is in place, I have to leave it there until we get them to medical attention. Only the doctors can prescribe to have this loosened or removed. Now remember, when we apply the tourniquet, it has to be snug with the Velcro strap to start. Once that's in place, we tighten with the windlass rod, place the rod in the holder, bring the Velcro tail across, finish with the time strap, write the time in there. Now, bleeding control is something that anybody can do, even with improvised materials. A clean rag, a triangular bandage, a t-shirt, or a belt to hold that pressure dressing in place. You can use a triangular bandage or a belt as a tourniquet. Bleeding control is something that can absolutely save lives. To summarize, there are 3 different types of bleeding: capillary, venous, and arterial. Most of the time, minor bleeding can be controlled with direct pressure. If it can't, we escalate to a tourniquet. These are all very important skills that can save a life. You can use improvised tools as a tourniquet or for direct pressure. But having something with you to accomplish this can absolutely save a life. We'll see you in the next lesson.